John stood frozen outside the veterans' lounge, ID in hand, denied entry, treated like a stranger in his own country. The cold weight of betrayal settled deep as whispers of injustice swirled around him. Then, a shadowy figure in a dark suit appeared, shifting everything in an instant. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. John Miller stood there, the sterile airport lighting casting cold shadows over his rugged face. Every crease, every scar beneath his neatly trimmed beard told stories of distant deserts, thunderous firefights, and nights spent on watch, protecting lives he'd never meet. Yet here, in the sprawling terminal miles from the front lines, those stories meant nothing. The glow of his medals, the bronze star, the combat action ribbon, reflected faintly off the glass door he was barred from crossing. His veteran ID badge hung around his neck, a symbol of years of sacrifice and service, yet it was dismissed with a curt shake of the head and a clipboard. The attendant, Lisa, appeared almost conflicted. Her politeness was mechanical, her eyes darting nervously between him and her manager's mandates. "Rules are rules," she said, voice clipped but with an undercurrent of reluctance. She wasn't the villain here, but a cog in a system that had no room for nuance. John's mind raced back to the firefights in Helmand Province, where decisions weren't black and white, but life and death, nuanced and brutal. Here, the rulebook was rigid, unyielding, and cold. The lounge, meant to be a refuge, felt like a battleground of its own, a place where trust and recognition should have been implicit, but was instead withheld without explanation. His frustration swelled. The wound wasn't just about access to a lounge, it was about recognition and dignity. Every soldier returns changed, carrying invisible burdens, and small acts of disrespect cut deep. To be denied entry when all he wanted was a moment's peace before a long flight home felt like a betrayal. The very institution that celebrated veterans with banners and public speeches now reduced him to a name on a list, a potential liability to be screened out. Lisa's apology did little to soothe him. Security concerns was a phrase tossed around too often in these post-9/11 days, a catch-all justification that often masked fear, prejudice, or bureaucratic indifference. He caught the flicker in her eyes, a mix of guilt and helplessness, caught between enforcing orders and empathy for a man who had seen things she couldn't imagine. John's jaw clenched as he took a deep breath, fighting the surge of anger threatening to boil over. The sting of injustice wasn't just personal, it was emblematic of a wider disconnect. Veterans returned to a society that praised their sacrifices publicly, but often failed to honor them privately. They were heroes on stage, but strangers in the crowd, faces blurred behind security protocols and red tape. He looked around, catching the wary glances of other travelers nearby, their curiosity thinly veiled behind polite disinterest. No one stepped forward. No one spoke up. The silence was deafening. For a moment, John felt isolated, not just physically barred from the lounge, but emotionally distant from a world that should have understood him. The shock of such blatant disregard seared through him. This wasn't just a denied entry. It was a breach of trust, a crack in the bond between a nation and those who pledged to protect it. He straightened his shoulders and met Lisa's eyes again, his voice steady but firm. "I served this country. I deserve more than just a list." Lisa hesitated, her hand tightening around the clipboard. The tension thickened like the heavy air before a storm. Around them, the bustling airport hummed on, indifferent to the quiet injustice unfolding by the lounge door. John's pride battled with the sting of rejection, his patience wearing thin. He wasn't just fighting for entry, he was fighting for respect, for every veteran who'd ever stood in line, only to be told they didn't belong. John sat heavily on the cold metal bench just outside the lounge, the weight of rejection pressing down on him far heavier than any gear he'd hauled through hostile zones. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching with a restless energy born of frustration and disbelief. The sterile hum of the airport faded into a dull roar as he replayed the scene over and over, the cold dismissal, The clipped words, the bureaucratic coldness that stripped away the meaning behind every metal pinned to his chest. Around him, the flow of travelers continued. Some glanced his way, their faces flickering with a mix of recognition and discomfort. A few veterans nodded subtly, the quiet solidarity of those who understood pain unspoken. Others turned their eyes away, unwilling or unable to confront the starkness of the moment. The air between them was thick with unspoken truths, a silent acknowledgement that John's experience was far from unique, that the gulf between those who served and those who watched from the sidelines had only widened with time. The sting of the moment was more than personal. It was emblematic of the yawning disconnect between a nation's gratitude in speeches and the reality of daily disregard. John felt it in every fiber, the betrayal of a society that honored its heroes in words, but relegated them to the margins when it mattered most. Suddenly, the presence of a sharply tailored figure shifted the dynamic. A man in a dark suit, sharp-eyed and purposeful, approached with measured strides. Mark Reynolds, a Secret Service agent on official travel, had noticed the tension as soon as he'd entered the lounge area. His gaze swept the scene, John's rigid posture, the lingering doubt in Lisa's eyes, the subdued crowd that hovered at the edges. "Sir, what's going on here?" Mark's voice was calm, but commanding, cutting through the noise like a knife. John's voice caught, briefly, emotions swelling as he compressed years of sacrifice and recent humiliation into a few succinct words. The agent listened intently, eyes narrowing with quiet indignation. The narrative of exclusion struck a chord with Mark, not just as a federal officer, but as a fellow guardian of the nation's ideals. "This isn't right," Mark said with conviction. "No veteran should ever be treated this way, especially not someone who's given everything." Without hesitation, Mark retrieved a secure phone from his jacket pocket and initiated a call. His tone was brisk, an unyielding command that swiftly set wheels in motion. Within minutes, a discreet but unmistakable contingent of Secret Service personnel materialized, their presence slicing through the lingering tension like a blade. The lounge, once a place of exclusion, was transformed. Guests were politely but firmly escorted out, leaving the space cleared with practiced efficiency. Lisa, the attendant, now visibly overwhelmed, struggled to maintain composure as Mark addressed her. "This is a restricted area for official use and invited guests only," he stated firmly. "Mr. Miller is authorized entry immediately." John's breath caught in his throat. The atmosphere shifted. What had begun as bitter rejection now brimmed with the unexpected weight of official recognition. The men and women sworn to protect the nation were stepping forward where the system had faltered. Their presence was more than procedural. It was a statement, a quiet rebuke to the bureaucratic blindness that had so recently shut a door in John's face. In that charged moment, the raw ache of exclusion began to give way to a fragile but fierce hope. Hope that respect could still be reclaimed, that dignity once denied might yet be restored. The seed of justice, watered by unexpected allies, took root in John's heart, a stubborn, unyielding promise that his sacrifice and the sacrifices of countless others would not be forgotten or dismissed. He rose slowly, the weight on his shoulders momentarily lighter, and met Mark's steady gaze. No words were necessary. The unspoken acknowledgement between them was electric. This was more than a victory for one man. It was a reminder that honor, when wielded with resolve, could still prevail against the crushing tide of indifference. John stepped across the threshold of the lounge, the air inside immediately shifting, thick with muted relief, reverence, and a newfound dignity. The sterile lighting, once cold and unwelcoming, seemed to soften, as if the very space recognized the rightful presence of those it had unjustly shut out. Veterans already inside turned toward him, their eyes a mixture of quiet admiration and shared triumph. In their faces was reflected a collective sigh, the burden of exclusion momentarily lifted, replaced by a surge of vindication that coursed through the room like a rising tide. This was no mere concession of entry. It was a symbolic reclamation. The veterans, often sidelined or overlooked, had been reinstated not by empty promises, but by an unmistakable assertion of their worth. John's entrance became a catalyst, the spark that ignited a broader reckoning within the airport walls and far beyond them. News of the Secret Service's intervention traveled swiftly through channels often impermeable to veterans' voices. Social media lit up with first-hand accounts and supportive commentary. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a rare but critical victory against systemic neglect. Airport management, previously complacent or willfully ignorant, found themselves in the glare of public scrutiny. The pressure mounted, relentless and uncompromising, forcing an immediate review and overhaul of guest policies. In boardrooms and meetings, executives debated and rewrote protocols with the unambiguous mandate that no veteran should ever again face such blatant dismissal. For John, the victory transcended the momentary satisfaction of having crossed an arbitrary threshold. It resonated deeply, intertwining with years of sacrifice, of silent suffering endured far from the public eye. This was resilience not born from mere endurance, but from the fierce refusal to be erased or ignored. It was the embodiment of a truth long known to those who serve. Respect is neither freely given nor easily won. It must be claimed with steadfast courage and unwavering conviction. Days later, at a packed veterans event, John stood before a sea of familiar faces, brothers and sisters in arms, many bearing scars both visible and hidden. His voice was steady, rich with the hard-earned wisdom of a man who had navigated both battlefields abroad and the trenches of bureaucratic indifference at home. "We fight for respect," he began, each word weighted with deliberate clarity, "for honor and for the freedom of others. But sometimes that respect is not handed to us. Sometimes we have to demand it, not just for ourselves, but for every veteran who has ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced." His gaze swept the crowd, igniting a spark of shared determination. Today, I witnessed that justice is not just an ideal written in speeches or etched on monuments. Justice is something we create by standing together, by refusing to accept injustice, by lifting each other up when the world tries to push us down. The room responded in kind, applause swelling like a wave of affirmation, hands rising in solidarity. The moment crystallized into a beacon for countless veterans grappling with their own battles beyond the battlefield. John's story became a rallying cry, a powerful reminder that the sacrifices made by those in uniform must never be relegated to shadows or forgotten in the noise of everyday life. In the days that followed, inspired by his example, many found the courage to speak out against their own experiences of marginalization. Letters poured in, voices united in a chorus demanding change. Veteran advocacy groups amplified the message, securing commitments from institutions nationwide to improve policies, to honor service in deeds as well as words. John's triumph was not a solitary victory. It was a catalyst for transformation. It reaffirmed the unyielding spirit of those who serve and sparked a movement rooted in justice, respect, and unwavering solidarity. A movement that would echo far beyond the walls of one airport lounge into the hearts and minds of a nation learning to truly value those who defend it.